Okay, well, that's a big question, and so I'll start. I think I can tackle that on three levels. First of all, most people in the community, if we start talking about, do you ever hide your food? Do you eat more? Can you stop when you want to? Will acknowledge, yeah, there's probably an addiction. What's interesting is that even though society at this point does not embrace food addiction, or at least not professional society, those of us in the field have been very busy for the last 5 or 10 years. More of us are becoming well versed and studied in the field. There's more research interest, there's more writing. And this consensus conference was a way to say there's all these clinicians all over the place. And, what does food addiction mean? For God's sakes, does it mean eating disorder? Does it mean, like, what does abstinence mean? Like, what do these things mean? We're all using the same words, but we don't even know if we agree. And so this group, headed by Jen Unwin and company, decided, well, let's first of all get a consensus, a conglomeration of people, so that we have a united front, because it's not helpful if we're just, disagreeing with fundamental concepts. So this was an attempt to say, let's, at least at the very first, get the name of the condition. And so we decided as a consensus to say, let's call it not sugar addiction, not food addiction, because that's so broad. Let's call it something very specific that's actually also very public, aware. People are very aware. Ultra processed food addiction. The thing about the 12-step program that makes me very happy about it is that it's so available and it's free. And a coach I have to pay for, a program I have to pay for, podcasts I can only listen to so many in a day or in a week or whatever. But a 12-step program, it's there whenever I need it, whether it's in the middle of the night, especially virtually now. We just hop onto something that's happening in the Ukraine or in the UK. Or a different hour change. Like, there's always something, and as long as you can get around some of the language, I know it's very old-fashioned, it's very Christian. Most of the people in a 12-step program have managed to adapt to make it very relevant to their lives, and that's really useful.
Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carbon Fasting. Okay, our guest today is an MD, but she's also accredited with the Board of Addiction Medicine. And she's been working since 1994, according to one of the websites I checked out, since 1994 as a food addiction expert. She's the medical director of Renaissance Rehab Center in downtown Toronto. She's a public speaker. She's author of Food Junkies, The Truth About Food Addiction. She's also the host of the Food Junkies podcast. Dr. Vera Tarman, welcome to Low Carbon Fasting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today.
Dr. Tarman, why don't we start with something that's been baffling me for a long time? I work as a health coach, and I come across people who struggle with food addictions. And yet, it's not as well known a condition as, say, I don't know, nicotine addiction, for example, or addiction to other substances, or addiction to alcohol. Almost everyone in the world has heard of these conditions, but not many people are aware that there is such a thing as food addiction. Why do you think? I'm interested in your sort of insights.
Okay, well, that's a big question, and so I'll start. I think I can tackle that on three levels. First of all, most people in the community, if we start talking about, do you ever hide your food? Do you eat more? Can you stop when you want to? Will acknowledge, yeah, there's probably an addiction. So, I mean, OA, Overeaters Anonymous, has been around since 1961, and there have been people talking about addictiveness of food. So other 12-step programs, which I know we'll talk about later. So it's not an unusual concept, an unheard of concept. But if we move beyond the community level, well, even in the community level, there's one major obstacle, and that is the sugar industry, or what we call big food, the food industry. They have no invested interest in supporting an idea that what they're producing is addictive. They'll say it's craveable, it's highly palatable, it's delicious, you can't stop at one, but they don't like the word addiction, probably because there's implications, legal implications, I don't know, but they're very resistant. And so that a lot of effort is put into, not so much overtly, but behind the scenes with research, funding, what gets published, what doesn't. There's a lot of effort into obscuring the results when we do come up with stuff, so that there's a economic interest in the community towards not appreciating that this is I think, like you say, why don't we know about this? It's more, why are we so resistant? Why are we so overtly overtly dismissive? Like, why do we push that in order to show love on Valentine's Day, you have to give a box of chocolates? I'm sure that the person who's getting the chocolates would much rather have a card of favors. Here's a card of 30 favors, like I will massage you, I will wash the dishes, I will take out the garbage, I will take out the dog late at night. I'm sure they would much prefer that over chocolates. However, it's the food. So that's there's an economic interest and a deliberate intent to confuse. That's at the community level. So it's almost like the community is, I wouldn't say fighting, but the people who are saying no to sugar definitely feel the brunt of that dismissiveness, because people will say, "Oh my God, you're being so restrictive," and all this stuff. So, and that's supported in the media. It's supported in social media, etc. Then on the next level, the professional level, you could ask, why are they so dismissive? And it's because it's not just they don't know about it, they dismiss it out of hand. And we have been battling, you mentioned Dr. David Wiss, and there's Dr. Unwin, they're all on a committee to get the DSM-5 and the ICD to approve this concept. And it's yes, it's economic too, because who funds most research and academics? It's either big food or it's big pharma, and both of them do really well with the way the situation is today. We get people fat, and then now we're getting them off being fat by giving medications. It works. It's a system that works. And so when something works so well, it's very hard to fight it. But then there's the other thing, and this is where actually Dr. David Wiss is so important, is that we already have a paradigm to discuss disordered eating. And it's taken years to get that paradigm put in place, which we call the eating disorders paradigm. We've got binge eating disorder, bulimia, various versions of that, not otherwise specified. And the committees of the DSM-5 and ICD are basically saying, we've already got something. And it's not just them. When I speak with people in my podcast, say, well, what about food addiction? And they say, we're already talking about food addiction. We talk about binge eating disorder. And I say, they don't know that there's a difference. And when you've got already a prevalent, it's usually in the psychological departments, a prevalent academic mainstay, I hate to say it, but there's probably some level of protecting your turf. And, this is our area, we do the food, and how are you different than us? And we have to constantly prove that we're different than us. Of course, it's really hard to do that. That's a whole other question if you want to talk about that. What's the difference between eating disorder and food addiction? All I'll say to answer this question is there's a big difference. And one makes the food industry culpable, and one makes the individual culpable. And the food industry likes the eating disorder model because it works for them. So it's on many levels that we don't want to hear this message.
Let's explore that more, because that was one of the points that I had. What exactly is the difference between disordered eating and food addiction? Because people who have food addictions, they're binge eating on maybe sugar or processed foods. Well, isn't that the same as disordered addiction? I haven't quite understood the difference.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people don't. And yes, and it's actually why the eating disorder community, which is quite a strong community, partly because it's funded by big pharma, like, it has the all of the supports that support the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry. So they are very powerful on that level politically, I think. And like I said, protecting turf academically. So essentially the difference is, and I think that, well, I'll say from our point of view as being outside of that model, we would say that the difference is that we're talking about, I'm putting a substance, I'm otherwise well, or maybe not well, but I'm otherwise me, and I put a substance into my body, a drug, food, it's a drug, and with enough exposure, not necessarily the first time. If I pick up a cigarette and I'm not a smoker from that point on, but if I continue to smoke a cigarette, maybe one every couple of days, soon it's going to be one a day, and then it's going to be a few a day. And the same thing happens with sugar. If we literally kept it at the moderation level that the food industry says we should, then no, there wouldn't be food addiction. But what's happening is that there's an addiction that's developing towards a drug food, a drug, which happens to be food. It's not even food, it's a food product, the industrial foods that are ultra processed foods. You keep introducing that, your body will start to adapt and make changes, which then become addiction. The eating disorder model says it has nothing to do with the food, it has to do with the psychology, because that's what they're the psychologists. We are the clinicians in biology, like doctors, or in sociology, social context, like the coaches and the social workers and whatever. So they're the psychologists, and they're looking at, this is a psychological dilemma that happens, and that you're using food as a treatment. But if you resolve the dilemma, you wouldn't need the food anymore. So their perspective is, don't look at the food because you're missing the boat. You want to deal with the psychological dimension. And so that's the main difference. And we're saying the person can be distressed and in history of trauma and all sorts of things, but that just predisposes them to addiction. But that isn't actually the dynamic. It's the food putting it into your mouth. So we would say you have to be abstinent from that food. Eating disorder model says it's not about the food. There's no abstinence required. There's just moderation, which you could do if you didn't have the psychological distress. And just to cap off that answer, numbers wise, there's a big difference, because we have statistics that say food addiction is certainly under 10%. It's usually around 5%, depending on if you're looking at anorexia or pure bulimia. Binge eating disorder, I don't remember what their numbers are, but I don't think it's more than 10% in their group. But in the food addiction world, thanks to Ashley Gerhardt's work, where she's actually, has a diagnostic tool to determine food addiction, she's saying it's at least 14 or 15 or 16% of the population more than eating disorder. So there's something else going on here. And in some populations, like overweight women, it's up to 50 or 60%. We don't say that with eating disorders, but we do say that with food addiction. So there's clearly something else going on. The problem is, just to end this question, is that you can often have both. That is what makes people pull out their hair, because they would say, I don't know if this is an eating disorder or a food addiction. You have to do all the tests, because it can look the same, and in fact often is similar, like it's in the same person. Yeah. It's a clinical dilemma for people.
Which makes it even more complex an issue, I think.
Yes. And the DSM-5, they say prove that it's different, and we say, well, we know it looks the same. It's a real dilemma. That's why people like David Wiss, who are trying to untangle some of the things, because that's what we need to do to get that DSM-5 approval.
Yeah. You're working towards that, right? With an international team. Where are you with that now? Because I heard about it at the PHC conference in London. So what's happening there in that?
Well, that was a beginning. That was the conference in London, was a food addiction consensus conference. And it was an attempt to say, okay, I mean, what's interesting is that even though society at this point does not embrace food addiction, or at least not a professional society, those of us in the field have been very busy for the last 5 or 10 years. More of us are becoming well-versed and studied in the field. There's more research interest, there's more writing. And this consensus conference was a way to say, there's all these clinicians all over the place. And, what does food addiction mean? For God's sakes, does it mean eating disorder? Does it mean, like, what does abstinence mean? Like, what do these things mean? We're all using the same words, but we don't even know if we agree. And so this group headed by Jen Unwin and company decided, well, let's first of all get a consensus, a conglomeration of people so that we have a united front, because it's not helpful if we're just, disagreeing with fundamental concepts. So this was an attempt to say, let's at least at the very first get the name of the condition. And so we decided as a consensus to say, let's call it not sugar addiction, not food addiction, because that's so broad. Let's call it something very specific that's actually also very public, aware. People are very aware. Ultra processed food addiction. So now that we've got a title, which of course there's dissent there too, but at least enough consensus that we can move forward. Now we've got a title. Now we've got to start talking about uniform, besides language, but uniform treatments, uniform diagnosis.
Yes.
It's the beginning process. So that's just the beginning of it. But anybody who's listening who wants to be in the clinical world as part of the we're essentially developing an established clinical world here, please follow this process because you want to be part of it.
Okay, you alluded to abstinence. So is it the only way out of addiction?
So
because if moderation doesn't work, so I mean, from an outsider, and thankfully I don't have any food addictions, but from an outsider, it just makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
Moderation will not work. And so what else can you do?
Yeah, well, here's where we need consensus as well. What is the definition of abstinence? Does it mean no food at all? Does it mean no sugar, only no processed foods, ultra processed foods? It's going to be another big mess. And this is part of the problem. With eating disorders, it's almost like very clear. It's easy to carve out areas, although it's actually not that easy because a lot of people with anorexia also have bulimic episodes. So it's not that easy. But anyway, with us, it's really muddy all over the place. And so when we talk about abstinence, there's the muddiest of concepts. What does that mean? Because, and most of us in the clinical world that are actually working with people will say it's completely individual because some people will, they know, there are some universals about what abstinence is. Usually it means no sugar, and usually it means no ultra processed foods. But some people can have some ultra processed foods, so it gets even muddy on that level. But usually it means no sugar, and then it starts to get muddy. So the next one would be no ultra processed foods, and then at some level, depending. You have to figure out how you're going to conceptualize this, but I conceptualize it as stages of food addiction. And that if a person is at an early stage, like really early, almost pre-addiction, they might even be able to have sugar on occasion. So moderation would work because they're not actually addicted. That might be somebody like you, for example. Like I bet you who don't identify as a food addict would also probably find if you're given a box of Girl Guide cookies or chocolates that you have one and you maybe want a couple more, or a bag of chips and you have a few more, but then you stop. There's still a desire to have a bit more. That's actually the food industry's working on your brain chemistry to make you want that more, but you're not a food addict. So on that level, if you would say to me, what should I do? I would say, you probably can moderate. And so abstinence for you would be to make sure it's moderation and not let it slip into every night and then every day, because that's what makes the dynamic of addiction move forward. So the word abstinence becomes kind of very harm reduction like, which means you just eat to reduce harm. So here you are eating, making sure it's very moderate, like once every, at most a week, maybe once a month, and nothing happens to you. So that's I don't know, the difference between moderation and abstinence gets fuzzy. But in the later stage of food addiction, it might mean I can't have sugar because that acts like a drug. And once I have one, I want more. So abstinence, no thing. But I can still have the occasional bag of chips. I can still have the occasional sweetener of something, like a protein bar with sweetener. And if they can truly moderate, that's their version of abstinence. Where I come in, because I'm an addictions physician and I'm interested, I know that abstinence, because obviously in alcohol and cocaine, whatever, you just don't pick up those substances. We know what you can avoid. So where I come in is say there are particular what we call trigger foods. You have to identify what they are, and that will be probably sugar, probably ultra processed food, but it might be for you cashew nuts. It might be for you cheese, a particular type of cheese. And if that triggers you to want more, that is now part of your definition of abstinence. But your version is going to be different than mine. You can eat the nut, I can eat the nuts, you can't. So it gets this is where a coach comes in. This is where somebody helps, because the addicted mind will say, I can moderate everything. The cocaine addict, the crack addict that's out there in the street, and you give them $5 and say, please don't spend that $5 on, or let's say maybe $10. Please don't spend that on drugs. They'll say, in their mind, they'll say, I won't, because I'm only going to use half of it, and the other half I'll use for my drug. But of course, they use all of it. Like it's called denial. The addicted mind will not get that they cannot moderate. So you can't do it alone. You need a coach. You need somebody to say, Vera, are you sure about that? Like really? To challenge that crazy mind that says you can do it. So anyway, the coach helps with the individualizing of the food, and then with the person determining, yeah, that is a trigger food and that isn't. And then at the end stage of food addiction, the last stage, because it is a chronic progressive condition, like all addictions. The person who's smoking once in a while and says, yeah, I'm a smoker, compared to the person with emphysema smoking with their oxygen tank, they're addicted. They know they're what's the definition of addiction? Use despite negative consequences, And so if a person is eating, despite the fact that they're obese, they have diabetes, they're all sorts of, they hate themselves, they wish they could stop and they can't. That end stage, they might not be able to eat sugar or flour, or highly processed foods, most fruits. That's actually where the low carb food plan and fasting actually become useful interventions, because those are usually for people in that, well, it's actually good for all stages. But anyway, it's a very good program because it gets rid of a lot of trigger foods without you even having to think about it. But anyway, that's the definition of abstinence is a moving target. But definitely the more addicted you are, the smaller your world becomes in terms of food choices.
I mean, it's interesting. I'm a member in your group, and reading people's struggles,
yeah,
and how very different they are from
yes,
one another's, and they often talk about trigger foods. And I think that's what it comes down to, about you finding what triggers you, because some people
yes,
might be okay with fruits, other people might not be okay with fruits. So even chewing gum keeps coming up in your group.
yes. Even like
Right?
sugar-free chewing gum. Yeah,
It's fascinating. I mean, I've learned so much from just reading the posts and your comments and people's comments, and it's a whole world for me. And I've learned so much from your Facebook group alone, and as well as, of course, your podcasts. What exactly is going on in an addict's brain? Because we quite often find that someone has given up alcohol. They're perfectly fine. They haven't touched alcohol for years, but now they're smoking. They give up the smoke, and now they're eating processed foods. What's happening there? Is there full relief for people like that?
Oh yes, there is. But here's where we would say it's a mental disorder. I don't really like that word, because I actually think that addiction is an adaptation to an abnormal environment. Like I think anybody, including you're not identifying as a food addict, but if you were living in a context where that's all you were eating, I think eventually you would. Some people more quickly than others. You might be a latecomer, but don't think you're free, because it's got to do with the exposure. Like if a person is drinking every day, they move to a country where alcohol is all the time, they're going to find that they're liking it more than they did before. Like it's a normal adaptation, I think, to an abnormal environment. But it becomes eventually, when it's chronic and progressive, a disorder. Like it's a disorder of our normal, natural neurochemicals, which are tapping into what are basically our motivational neurochemicals, the things that keep me wanting to be alive and wanting to do things. If my normal system was flattened out, tapped out for some reason because of stress or trauma or whatever, you would call me depressed or anxious or borderline 2. We have all sorts of medical psychiatric diagnosis to discuss, to capture the reward pathway gone wrong when it's not about drugs. But when you add drugs to the mix, then we start calling it addiction, or an overlay on top of addiction. It's just normal neurochemistry that has been dysregulated, usually by the food industry, but not necessarily only that, but I would say that's 80% of it. And so what they do is they figure out what those normal neurochemicals are and overload them. And basically what we're talking about is dopamine. There's more than just the dopamine story, but that gets most of it. And the food industry has made foods hyper palatable, which essentially means dopamine surges. And those are far more than what the brain can handle. So they become, there's surges in the same way that cocaine is a surge, and the same way as nicotine is a surge. And when you get these surges or surplus, or there's many words, just too much dopamine all at once, the body will start to react by readjusting, and then which we call tolerance, and then that whole development of addiction happens. And that happens with food. But if you already came to the scene because you were a smoker, this is a classic example. You're a smoker, you quit smoking, and then you start eating instead. Because that dopamine deficit, now that you're not smoking, will be fed easily by the sugar. And similarly, we see this with alcoholics too. I see this all the time in my work. The person quits their alcohol and then they start eating. In fact, they're encouraged to, because they figure, well, sugar's not as bad as alcohol. And so then they start eating, and then now they have a new addiction, or their addiction has transferred, because it's basically just about the dopamine surplus. And then when it's in deficit because you've quit, it's got to be fed somewhere else. And that's what's happening. We just see the moving along. So there's a problem with the dopamine. It's being deranged, and the treatment for that is not to give a different behavior, like I don't know, people, when they quit sugar, they'll start chewing gum, they'll start shopping too much, working too much, go back to alcohol, go back to like whatever. The difference is, treat that dopamine deficit, which is what we call post withdrawal, and then start managing this new condition that you now have called addiction in basically an abstinent manner. What is the food that made that surplus? Get rid of it. That takes about 3 or 4 weeks, and then keep off the wagon, or stay on the wagon. I'm not sure what the hell that works. Anyway, stay sober, because you don't want to pick up again. And that's it. Actually, the treatment of addiction is very simple, but it's really not easy, because you're dealing with a mind that wants that stuff. So anyway, there is treatment. And you'll see in the Facebook group, which for folks who are listening, it's I'm Sweet Enough, Sugar Free for Life. You'll see that there's many of us who have been sober for years, and you've read the despairing posts, but you've also read the posts where there's hope. It's been 10 years and I've lost weight and I don't have diabetes anymore and I don't have cravings and I feel great. And they're there helping the newcomers coming in. But there's a lot of them. I want to end, and hopefully by the time we end this podcast, I want that message of hope to be really clear for people, that yes, this is a condition, you're going to have to put the work in, but there is a solution: freedom from obsession.
When you said hope, that reminded me of the message that Dr. Jen Unwin also pushes forward. There is hope, the message of hope, or the message of hope.
Absolutely.
Talking of dopamine again, so what exactly needs to be done to regulate, if that's the right word, or to balance the dopamine receptor, so people aren't seeking that surplus all the time. You mentioned the withdrawal. Okay, so there will be a withdrawal period.
Yeah.
So once they're through the withdrawal period, have they regulated their dopamine sort of release?
Well, they're in the process of regulating when they stop their drug. So what happens when you're sitting there exposing yourself to a substance that is highly dopaminergic, that gives you dopamine surplus, what's happening is the brain is going, there's too much, and it starts to reduce the receptors. It's called downregulation of dopamine 2 receptors. But what happens when you stop using, so those receptors have been downregulated, so now you need more to get the same effect. And then when you stop using, you don't have anything, and yet your dopamine receptors are hungry, the ones that are left, going, what happened? We need this. And so what happens is when you stop, you're in horrible discomfort, which we call withdrawal, and that manifests as anxiety, and I can't sleep, and I just want to eat all the time, and it's a terrible, unpleasant place to be, and that's where a lot of despair happens, and people give in and relapse. But if you can sit through that, what happens is the body will start to, the brain will start to go, where did all that dopamine go? We need to upregulate, grow back. I don't know if they grow back or just reopen the doors. I don't know how they do it, but the receptors become upregulated again. And so that they're over a period of usually estimated 3 weeks, there's a normalcy that happens. There's a sort of upregulation back to, I wouldn't say normal, but almost normal. So that, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks, something like that, you don't want that sugar as much as you did earlier on, or the cigarette, or the alcohol. It takes a while, but once you get there, you're kind of on square one again, but not really, because something's happened to you, and this trauma of overindulgence and then underindulgence, it registers as trauma and stress, and you now live with the memory of that. And a lot of addiction is psychological. It's not just physiological. I'm just giving the physiology, but don't forget, with addiction we say it's physical, psychological, and social, and you got those dimensions now to deal with, which makes addiction so hard. And in the 12-step program, we have 12 steps. And the first 2, 3, or really 1 step is about putting down the substance, the food, the drug, whatever. And then the rest of the steps are all about, what do I do now with that memory, that trauma of addiction that is in my past, and then living in a world where there's drug pushers everywhere. Everywhere. I don't even have to leave my house, and I have sugar pushed into my face. And how do I live with that? Because I now have a changed constitution. So I really don't think that once you become sober, you can just pick up again. You're a changed person, but you can live happy nevertheless, just with vigilance.
Two things come to mind now. So we were talking about switching from one substance that releases excess dopamine from one to another. But how about, I mean, we know that physical activity, for example, or exercise, going for a walk and swimming, going to the beach, all of these also release dopamine.
Yeah.
Maybe not to very high levels, but they are dopamine releasing activities. So are they encouraged as part of someone's treatment plan?
Yes, because as I said, that you're now changed for life, and you don't want to pick up again. So all of those activities will not help when you're in the food, when you're trying to stop. I mean, you're trying to stop, you stop, and then you do exercise, just meditate. And people say, I don't want to, I just want to eat, I can't, I'm pacing the floor. They're not going to stop. But what they will do is start instituting a pattern of behavior, so that when the physiology of the withdrawal starts to subside, which is 10 days, 12 days, whatever, you have something now to transfer to. And yes, you have to do that. That's what we call recovery. We want to recover our own natural neurochemicals and use them appropriately by exercise, by meditation, by social engagement. We want to go back to that world, recover that old world that we put aside for this crazy, insane place that we were in shortly. If you don't do that, if you don't exercise, socially engage, whatever, you're just sitting there going, what did I get sober for? Like, I want to feel good. I want to feel motivated. And if you're not doing those things, the memory because you know what the difference is between the person who's not had an addiction and the one who has but is in recovery is that the one that has a memory. It's like I have information that you, Nayiri, you don't have because you haven't been addicted, and I live with that memory so that if I have a really bad day, I'm not going to go, oh geez, should I exercise more or talk to my friend? I'm going to go, I know what I can do. I can just get a bag or a tub of ice cream, and that's gonna, it's like the alcoholic. I'll just get a bottle of wine if things get too stressful. We have a memory. It's like Adam and Eve. They've eaten the apple, they've lost the innocence of, I just got to do it. We know what we can do. And living with that memory, that's the psychological dilemma that people live with. And so you're going to have all sorts of tools. That's where you call up the coach, the 12-step person to say, oh my God, I know I shouldn't do this, but so something terrible happened, lost my job. I really want to drink. I really want to eat. And then the person will say, you don't want to do that. It's not going to help. But you wouldn't do that because you don't have that memory, but you're gonna call and ask for help the way you should. And anyway, what I'm trying to say here is, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think I said it.
Well, you covered the dopamine parts really well, I think.
Yes, yes. So you want to get exactly. You do want to get back to the recovery. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Just to finish that off. That so when I exercise or socially engage or do a project that I really like, whatever, I know in the back of my head, this is good, but it's not as good as the tub of, or as easy as the tub of ice cream. But you know what? The further away you are from using active use, like longer in recovery, that memory it's still there, but it gets dusty and a little shady. And it's like, oh, be quiet. I'll just put up with this. So we have all sorts of tools on how to do that. This too shall pass, and progress, not perfection, all sorts of tools to help us stay, because we're not going to get the immediate solution that we had once, but we learn how to live. We learn how to live life. Essentially, we learn how to grow up. And yeah, that's the recovery is I don't want to say it's a full-time job. It's a full-time process, but you get full-time results.
It's a full-time effort, I think, conscious effort, maybe.
Yeah. But you know what? It's a full-time effort to live life well. Like you, I'm sure, have got lots of issues in life. Everybody does. And you just, yourself, you have to get up and, like, you're doing a podcast, you got to do stuff that's good. Like it's work to live life well, but it's worth it, right?
Forget all the podcast and my other career responsibilities or family responsibilities. I am a type 1 diabetic.
Oh, okay.
I have to manage it.
Yes,
I have to manage
exactly.
it on an hourly basis. It's a full-time job. So I completely relate to that full-time job a sort of aspect of it. It is a full-time job. You cannot just ignore it and pretend, it's not there. It is there. You have to live with it and manage it.
Yeah, I'm glad that you made that analogy, because it's exactly like that. And to live well, it becomes part of your life, right?
Well, exactly. And and you can live a very meaningful and healthy life as long as you learn how to manage it.
Yes.
So you used the word exposure earlier on. I have a few questions about exposure, but now that I brought in the type 1 diabetes analogy, I've come across questions in your group where people post their food photos. Yeah. And as a type 1 diabetic, occasionally, I see a photo and all I'm seeing is sugar, sugar on top of sugar, on top of sugar, on top of sugar. And I'm thinking, if I had that, this person may not be diabetic at all, type 1 or 2, but if I had that, I know what's going to happen to me within an hour or 30 minutes. I'm going to have to inject insulin, of course. A non-diabetic's body would do that naturally, release insulin, but I'm going to give myself a large bolus of insulin. Blood sugar is just going to crash. Then I'm going to get hungry and angry and have mood swings and I'm going to reach out for food again. And that
Yes.
food is going to be sugar, of course, because my body's just wants sugar when I'm crashing. My blood sugar is crashing rapidly. So how relevant is that to the diet of, say, a food addict? So the blood sugar regulation, is that important?
Yeah, yes, it is. But again, it has to do with, I think, the level of food addiction that a person's at. So in that Facebook group, the only stipulation is that it's no added sugar or refined sugar. So if it's the sugar in fruit or vegetables, that's fine. And it is fine for some people, because my goal in that group is to, I guess, toxify the concept of sugar, that sugar is a toxin, added sugar, refined sugar. And that if a person is able to moderate via fruit and vegetables and keeps it there, they probably are okay. But because they're not a type 1 diabetic, and they may not yet be a type 2 diabetic. So I'm trying to capture, because that's my message, let's just get rid of sugar. But for the people who are in later stages of food addiction, I think it becomes much more relevant that, there are some fruits like dates, or I don't know if those, yeah, I guess that's considered a fruit, bananas and things like that, which are just really high in sugar, and people should probably just avoid them. But people will find that out if they're following the principles of trigger foods. They're going to find out that on their own, it's an individual story. And my perception is the more you move down the stages of food addiction towards end stage, your food is going to become lesser and less carbs. So lesser and less sugary carbs, well, carbs in general, so that ultimately there'll be keto for sure, and maybe in some cases carnivore. So I guess yeah, I guess that's really what I'm saying. Yeah, I do think that there's I haven't seen it in the literature yet. I'm really tempted to try to write something about this, but it's hard to conceptualize cleanly. But I really think that the more metabolically deranged you are, i.e. diabetic, the more, especially type 2, the more sensitive you are to carbohydrates, both physically and also mentally, which means addiction. Like, I think there's a parallel, which means low carb. Ultimately means even fasting, but we'll talk about fasting shortly.
Let's talk about the ketogenic diet, because I think not long ago you were put out, I can't remember when it was, but probably a few weeks ago, you put out, I watched it on YouTube, an episode on the ketogenic diet and food addictions. So let's talk about that, and then bring in fasting, whether fasting is harmful to a food addict or whether it can help. Because I think it depends on the person, right? Some people do very well with skipping a meal, but some people just binge eating when they skip a meal. So
yeah, so a ketogenic diet is, I'm sure everybody listening knows what that is, but it's low carb or very minimal, like 20 grams or 30 grams of carbohydrates or less. And at that level, probably the derangement of dopamine receptors, because carbohydrates, when they metabolize into sugar, are dopaminergic. And if you have a normal system, you can probably tolerate, I usually say it's like 1 or 2 apples a day, or a certain amount of fruit a day, or vegetables a day. I really struggle with the people who are doing plant-based, because I just don't know how that works when it's in later stage of food addiction. But people tell me, so I try to keep an open mind. People who are in the plant-based world say, we do it. And all I think of in my mind there is, there are probably people that are not at end stage food addiction and are not so metabolically deranged, but I don't know, because I don't know them and I'm not studying their parameters. I remain in some confusion about that. But for the most part, my experience is that the more food addicted you are, probably the lower carb you should be, because you're carb sensitive. And if you're already responding on your CMG, continuous glucose monitor, CGM, if you're responding, then that means that there's some carbohydrate insulin resistance already. That's already happening. And then my guess is that there's already something happening in the addiction piece as well. And so it's just better to be lower carb the more you move along, so that you can halt the progression of the addiction. I think I've answered that question. Is there more? No, I think so.
I think we covered it. So
now we want to talk about fasting.
Well, yes, I'd like to talk about fasting because it works like magic for some people. It doesn't on others. What's happening there?
Yeah, so here's the thing, and people who are proficient at fasting will know this. You have to be fat adapted. You can't be just, what usually happens with people, and this is in the food addiction world all the time, people pig out on something and then they hate themselves because they've just gained weight, or they just hate themselves and they say, I'm not going to eat, I'm going to fast. I'm going to fast for 3 days, and then they'll maybe fast for a day, and then they'll binge because they're so hungry, they're so hypoglycemic, they have not fat adapted, their sugars are down, the fuel's down. It takes a while to develop the ability to use your proteins and fats, which is being fat adapted, and that's essential for successful fasting. And so the food addict doesn't have that period of time because they're food addicted. They're not eating too much steak. I mean, they might be at some point, but 95% of people who are food addicted are eating too many carbohydrates, and then maybe proteins and fats on top of it. And so they don't have that capacity to sustain hunger in a way that is effective. It's just misery. And what does that lead to? But a pattern of binge and purge and binge and purge, or binge and restrict, binge and restrict. So restriction leads to binging. And what does that do? That leads to again, it's like the addiction thing. It leads to a memory, a body memory, a traumatic memory that the brain had of, I was hungry. When you're hungry, you are in distress. And when you're sugar hungry, in other words, the glucose hypoglycemia, you are in big time distress because your brain is needing fuel, and you haven't yet adapted to using ketones. Like it's a process of time. So you're going to be in a lot of pain and distress, and that pain and distress will register so that the next time you try to fast or be hungry, you're going to just reach for the potato chips even more quickly. It's like the opiate addict. You know, to quit heroin, to quit opiates, the withdrawal is very unpleasant, no question about it. But you know what makes it really unpleasant is the opiate addict who has done it many times and they've been through it. And the moment they start to feel sick, they're thinking, oh my God, it's going to be 4 days of sitting on the toilet and vomiting and having diarrhea. And that is so uncomfortable, even on the first day, before it would actually be hard for somebody else. We live with a memory. And similarly with food addiction, when a person lives with that memory, if it keeps that binge restrict cycle, it's bad news. So I worry about people when they, especially now fasting is so popular, I worry about it because people are using it either to self-harm themselves, because that's what they're doing, or to lose weight quickly. And both of those are bad reasons. I think that fasting has lots of good health reasons, but for the food addict, they should probably wait until they're stable and eating probably ketogenic or carnivore. I think that's quite possible. So you mentioned somebody that you know who does a once a day, which is, you know, a very prolonged intermittent fasting, but they're fat adapted and they're probably eating very low carb, and it's not that hard. All that memory of restricting, starving, all that stuff is not getting triggered, activated. That would be a better word.
Yeah, and they are eating sufficient protein.
Exactly.
Animal
Yes.
protein.
Yeah. And so then they have hunger that's not the same kind of hunger as the other person does, which is that frantic, crazy, oh no, it's painful, you know, that kind of thing. It's not the same experience. But I think it takes a while. It's almost like an athlete. You're asking somebody to run a mile, and they barely can walk a mile slowly. So you want to build them up to that's my sense, especially with food addiction. And then the other thing I say is that often a lot of the benefits that you achieve by fasting, you can achieve by a good food addiction food plan. In other words, that you do fast between meals. You either have 2 or 3 meals, but don't eat in between. You still want to have the fasting. You don't need, because you're eating the proper foods. And when you stop eating ultra processed foods and sugars, a lot of the good stuff that happens there. Like you don't actually need to go to the extent of fasting. I love it when I hear people say, I fast just because it feels better, not because I have to, but it feels better. It works for me. Yeah.
And not because it's a punishment.
Exactly. Yeah. Which, yes.
You binge
Yeah.
and then you're punishing yourself because you
Yes.
feel bad and guilty.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
that's just a vicious cycle, right?
And so many people in the food addiction world, that's exactly their story.
Yeah.
Or they fasted for 6 months and it was horrible, horrible. Because you know what they did? They didn't eat except for one meal a day. And then what they ate wasn't a good carnivore or whatever. It was like all the tempting foods. Because I remember doing this myself. I thought, okay, if I'm only going to eat 800 calories or whatever it is in my meal, it's not going to be the Brussels sprouts. It's going to be the stuff I really like the cheesecake and the Snickers bar and all that kind of stuff. What does that do? That has just set me up for another hypoglycemic crash and all the rest of that stuff. And so that you're suffering for 8 months doing that, that's terrible. It's not the way to go. I think we need to work up to it. I like that analogy. It's like an athlete. You work up to it, and then you can do it well.
Yes, someone called it, I think, build up the fasting muscle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's good. I like that. Yeah.
Okay, so all right. So earlier on, you mentioned exposure. I think exposure is an important element of food addiction sort
Yeah.
of problem
The
because
development of it. Oh, you mean exposure, constant exposure day to
also
day?
because we're exposed to food,
Oh,
we're
yes.
exposed to all these
Oh, yes.
I mean, 80%
Absolutely.
of what's sold in grocery stores is ultra processed food. So
Yes.
we're constantly exposed. You watch television, 90% of the adverts are
Yeah.
are of ultra processed
And
foods.
then the other 10, and then the other 10% are on Ozempic.
Medications, I was
Yeah.
about to say.
Yeah.
True. And so that makes it really tough because we're not seeing, we're not that exposed to alcohol adverts or cigarettes, etc. these days. But ultra processed foods, they're all around us.
Absolutely.
And so that makes it really tough for people who are addicted to foods.
Yes.
It must be much harder than smoking or anything else I can think of.
Yeah, well, it's harder now than smoking, but back in I work in a treatment center, and I have seen it's just crazy. We are so socially influenced by each other because we're social creatures. I see people going in for their cocaine addiction. They used to be a smoker, but they aren't, and then they stop their cocaine or alcohol. They stop it. They're there for a month. By the time they leave, they picked up smoking again because they're standing out there in the back with the other women who are smokers, and they go, "Yeah, I used to smoke. I don't anymore, but I'll have a cigarette." And then they're now smokers again because and they knew better. But the thing is we are. I think when you talk about exposure in this way, we are more social creatures than we know that we are. Like when it's there and it's so permissible and in fact expected, it's very hard to not want to do it. I myself, I know better, and I have in the past when I didn't have the support, which is the next thing I'm going to say, would always talk myself out of, Vera, you're just being crazy again. You're being irrationally rigid. You don't need to do that. And people would be telling me I'm being rigid, and I would believe them. Even though I didn't, I would in that moment. We are so socially influenced so that I would pick up again and then be in misery. So we have to acknowledge we are social creatures. And then the next thing to do is, because we're such social creatures and because there's such a invasive environment of food cues, the food addict is going to need an equal amount of buffer. And that buffer against all that messaging is social support. That's why I do the Facebook group for free. I'm on there myself. It helps me. The more you are engaged in the buffer, you're matching the opposing. So that I essentially live in a bubble, a food addiction sobriety bubble, because I belong to a 12-step group. I belong to the group. I do service. I do podcasts like this. Like it's my bubble. So that to my mind, when somebody says you're being rigid, I just think you don't understand. But if I were on my own out there in the world, I would be susceptible even after 15 years of food sobriety. It's just, that's who we are. And so I really encourage people who struggle, ask yourself, it's not just about the food and the psychology, it's also, am I protected? Like, you need to have a buffer. Until now, I don't feel the need to see. I used to be a smoker as well. And now, because people have to go out to another room outside, I'm not tempted. I always say this in wherever I can. I know I will be happiest. My goal of having any kind of influence will be when I see people having to go outside on the deck or outside of the restaurant to have their dessert. That would be great. Keep it out of my sight and out of other
Yeah.
people's sight. And then we won't want that stuff. So yeah, we need to have lots of support. That's where podcasts come in handy. That's where coaches come in handy. That's where 12-step groups come in handy. There's so many ways to get that support now. And take it, and then when you've got it, give it back, because you're still getting it that way. Yeah.
I just thought of something that as a society, I think we're more permissive about, food addictions. Like, people jokingly say,
I
hey,
know.
I'm a chocoholic. I'm a
Yeah.
chocoholic. No
Yeah.
one really comes and, proudly announces that they are addicted to alcohol, but everyone says, oh, I'm a chocoholic, right? So
Yes.
as if it's something to celebrate.
Yes. Yeah.
So maybe we need to change
Oh,
our
we need to change
mindset.
that. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to be a downer and say that's not funny when somebody makes that joke, but I do sort of cringe inside and go, oh man, if you only connected the dots, that thing that you're laughing about is going to cause your type 2 diabetes in 5 to 10 years. Like, I don't want to be a downer all the time. I'll just do it in podcasts. But out there in the world, yes, you're right. That'll be a sign that we've made a change, because we don't make those jokes about cigarettes anymore.
Yeah.
It's a matter of timing, I think.
So the 12-step program, you do, so what does it exactly include? Because I think you said the first 3 steps
Right.
on the
Yeah.
social side.
Yeah.
How do
Yes.
people cope with the societal pressures? You
Yeah.
get
So
invited to an event and all they're offering is processed carbs, right?
yeah, yeah. The thing about the 12-step program that makes me very happy about it is that it's so available and it's free. And a coach I have to pay for, a program I have to pay for, podcasts I can only listen to so many in a day or in a week or whatever. But a 12-step program, it's there whenever I need it, whether it's in the middle of the night, especially virtually now. We just hop onto something that's happening in the Ukraine or in the UK. Or a different hour change. Like, there's always something, and as long as you can get around some of the language, I know it's very old-fashioned, it's very Christian. Most of the people in a 12-step program have managed to adapt to make it very relevant to their lives, and that's really useful. So I really advocate for that. Like I said, you want a bubble to protect you against the influences out there. And the thing about 12-step, well, the food program, AA, alcohol is alcohol is alcohol. And the standard thing is don't drink alcohol, because it's easy to not drink alcohol, you just don't pick it up. But with food, because it is so hard and it's so individual what abstinence means, there are many different food addiction groups, which is good and bad. Bad because it's so many, we don't have the same voice as AA, but good because it means that if you're able to eat a few carbs, you're going to go to one program versus another one where there's very restricted. There's even a low carb food addiction one now. So like I think I did a YouTube channel for people who want to hear more about what I have to say. I have a YouTube channel called Vera Tarman MD, and I did one on the comparisons of, I think it's 14 or 15 FA food addiction programs. So there's a lot of them, and it's actually somewhat overwhelming. But I'll just say quickly, there's Overeaters Anonymous, there's Food Addicts Anonymous, there's Food Addicts in Recovery Anonymous, there's Gray Sheeters Anonymous, there's a number of them. And OA is probably the biggest one, but anyway, it exists. And I think make it work for you, because it's a support. You could literally be on a meeting every minute of the day if you had to, like on a hard day. And a lot of people will say, go to AA and just say, I'm an addict. A lot of AA meetings now, especially virtually, are fine with somebody saying, hi, I'm Vera, I'm an addict, as opposed to I'm an alcoholic, if you can't relate to alcohol as an issue. So anyway, that's my pitch for a free support group. Yeah.
But how about this? So pressure from family members.
Oh, yes.
Don't
Yes.
really appreciate, or pressure from friends. You go out with a friend and then before you know it, they're pushing
yeah.
It's Starbucks coffee with,
I know
12 teaspoons of sugar in it. So
yeah, you basically, it's about setting boundaries and learning how to say no. It is not easy to be sugar-free in a sugar-laden world. There's no question about it. It's not easy, but it is doable, and you will need support, which is why I'm talking about these various levels of support. Because you will have to say, I know you made this because you love me, but I can't have this. I mean, you as a type 1 diabetic, you must get incensed when somebody says, just have more insulin and eat this thing. Doesn't that make you mad? Like,
yeah,
it makes me mad just to think about that. It's your health. And similarly, it's my health, it's our health. So it's going to be learning to, it's not about learning how to say yes to those things, but how to say no to those things diplomatically, because you want to live with people, you want to acknowledge their desire to show love, but still protect yourself. It's a skill, and that's, again, where coaching and therapy and groups come in handy, because they'll help you. Other people will say, this is what I did, but it's all about protecting your sobriety in a easy way, like in a nice way with other people.
Yeah, I know how I deal with social events. First, I don't go hungry because there may not be appropriate foods there for me.
Exactly.
And if I'm hungry and all they're offering is carbohydrates and bread and jelly, then I'm gonna be hungry. I'm used to staying hungry. It doesn't bother me anymore. But that's but it's, I always eat before I go.
Yes.
And that's
or bring your own food.
Yeah, that's one thing I do. I have protein, even if it's just a few boiled eggs. That's really satiating. So you go to an event and you're not tempted by the bread there.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I do. But the second thing is, at least people who are close to me, I'm very open with them. Look, I have type 1. I'm wearing a CGM. I hear it beep all night long. There are certain foods I eat, certain foods I don't eat. So can we just mutually agree on a restaurant that offers foods which are appropriate for me? So it's about opening up. And I think, having people understand and support you.
Yes, absolutely.
The same would apply to food addicts, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. It's a little harder to get people to understand, but yes, that's why I say they should buy my book. It explains it well.
Absolutely. All the links will be below, by the way. All the links will be below. And yeah, you can't hide your condition. And there is no shame in it. There really is no shame in it, because if you want people to support you, you have to be open and talk about it.
Yeah.
Dr. Tarman, I can't thank you enough for your time. I really appreciate this. This is going to be a fabulous, fabulous episode. I can't wait to release it, actually.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your asking me to expound on this stuff and spread the message. Thank you for thinking it's important to spread the message.
Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Okay, thank you.